Gender reaches into disability. Disability wraps around class. Class strains against abuse. Abuse snarls into sexuality. Sexuality folds on top of race. Everything finally piling into a single human body. To write about any aspect of identity, any aspect of the body, means writing about this entire maze. This I know, and yet the question remains, where to start?
Hello and welcome once again to the Spouter-Inn. I'm Chris.
And I'm Suzanne.
And today we're looking at Eli Clare's memoir and essay collection, Exile and Pride.
Yeah, we're getting to it a little belatedly. 2020 has not relinquished its grip on us too easily, but we're ready to start with something that I think will help us to sort of set a chart out for the new year, some of the things we want to think about going forward.
Yeah, this is the second year we've rung in, and we are making a bit of a tradition of looking at a text at the beginning of the year that's maybe something that we haven't been looking at enough of, a type of writing or a group of authors that we haven't been looking at as much. And this time around, I really wanted us to look at something by a contemporary trans writer.
And this has been incredibly interesting because it wasn't, I don't know if this is a bad way to put it, it wasn't what I expected. It took us, I think, in very unexpected directions, especially thinking around disability issues, which I hadn't expected to come to. And that was really quite powerful, I felt.
Yeah. You don't want to reduce these things to a kind of checklist or boxes to tick. Last year we did Indigenous literature and now we are doing trans writing and, oh, goody, we get an extra helping of disability writing at the same time. Nothing like that necessarily. It's just thinking about, well, what aren't we looking at, and maybe trying to encourage us to hear other voices and bring other things into the conversation that don't normally get included when discussing great books.
Yeah, well, to ask ourselves, what are we not noticing?
Exactly.
Right? What are we not recognizing? And what should we be attuned to and thinking about going forward?
And it's also important to say that, we're picking one writer, or maybe we'll end up looking at more than one writer over the course of time. But for right now, for the beginning, we're picking one book by one writer. And that writer is not everybody from that group of people. Just as Lee Maracle is not all Indigenous writers, so is Eli Clare not all trans writers or all disabled writers. He has a particular point of view and a particular history, and we're going to read the book with that in mind.
Yeah, I felt like this was a neat choice for us to look at because it's clearly a book that's had an impact over time. That is, I think, I get the sense it's been received by readers and responded to in slightly different ways over time. It came out originally in 1999 and then in a new edition in 2009. And it wasn't just a reprint. I mean, there's a new preface, there's notes to it that the authors added that kind of show him revisiting and rethinking some of the things he had said in the first publication of the book. And I was really struck by that because it wasn't just going back and revising the book. It was keeping it, as a record of that moment in 1999 and yet adding something more. So I thought that was really neat.
And a lot of the things that were added were in particular ways that he felt he could have better thought about or been better informed by writers of color. And critical race theory and things like that, recognizing the gaps in his knowledge and his thought processes when he was writing this and reckoning with them and grappling with them a bit more. Mm-hmm. And really highlighting them for the reader who may also not be thinking fully about them to say, no, this is a better way to think about things.
And really gracefully modeling that learning process, I thought. In other words, it would have been all too easy just to revise those sections, right, and make it invisible. But this was, I feel like much more ethical way to do it. And I thought that was really moving.
And I think it also did a good job underlining one of the main themes of the text, which the quote that we began the episode with, our cold open, identified, which is that all of these different aspects of identity fold into each other. They reach into each other, they grab into each other, they wrestle with each other, they change each other, they poke at each other. And this is a key thing. It's like, no, we need to account for all of them. Mm-hmm. One of the things that I especially loved about this book was that insistence on making it more complicated by looking at all the different factors at play in any given situation and not just simplifying it into, disability, trans, gay, rural, well, whatever. It was always, but all these things, this and this and this and that.
Yeah, and I like the point you're making that it's not just that it's a kind of an accumulation of subject positions, right? It's that they're fighting with each other at times, or intertwined with one another, or in concert with one another, or pushing against. You know what I mean? That it's very dynamic.
Yeah, it's very dynamic. It's hopelessly specific as well, right? Like there's a sense in which you might have these large categories such as disabled, but like that category isn't big enough to hold one person, so to speak. You're always spilling out into other categories, and all of these need to be reckoned with. I feel like I'm repeating myself at this point, but that's okay. It's a lot to think about, and hopefully we're going to do a reasonable job talking about it. It's very delicate in some ways, and I feel a little bit nervous going into it, and I want to say that up front.
Yeah, I felt the same way. But I feel like, we've had the experience in the past. We've been reading something that we've been aware of our own limitations in reading and trying to sort of reach out, and get closer and learn, and in a respectful and kind of, I know this sounds stupid, but like humble way, right? Like where you're aware you don't know a lot, and just trying to be really open to learning from what you're reading. And so if this is a beginning for us, that's a really good thing.
So we'll start by saying a little bit about Eli Clare's biography. He was born in the 1960s in a small logging town in Oregon named Port Orford, was born with cerebral palsy, and had a lot of terrible things done to him when he was young. Medically and otherwise, I suppose, but survived that and went on to get a BA in Women's Studies, an MFA in Creative Writing, and has written a few books, including Exile and Pride, the one that we're looking at now. There's a recent essay collection called Brilliant Imperfection, Grappling with Cure, which I'm super intrigued by. I'm really intrigued by the notions of cure as they're discussed in disability circles.
I read a bit of it. It's actually beautiful. It's really beautifully written.
Oh, yeah. Good. Oh, good. I've got it sort of queued up, but I didn't have the time to read it before we recorded this. And he's also written poetry and has a poetry collection out called The Marrow's Telling Words in Motion from 2007. Mostly he's known, I suppose, for these and also for having done a lot of activism with disability, queer, and trans communities, and perhaps more communities than that. Really has done quite a lot of different kinds of work.
Yeah. And we learn more about his life experiences through the course of reading the chapters in Exile and Pride, and in a very layered kind of way. I mean, we get a very clear sense of the different stages of life that Eli Clare has been through, the way in which things have changed over time, including his own relationship to his body and sense of identity. And so that's something we're going to unpack a little bit probably as we go along. The book encourages us, I think, in its organization to understand identity in a very grounded kind of way. It's divided into two parts, each of which has several chapters, one called place, one called bodies. And I find that asymmetry, right? Like it's not places and bodies or place and body, right? It's place and bodies, right? There's a symmetry and then an asymmetry almost immediately, right? And that may sound kind of like overreading, but it strikes me that off balance quality is something that we find throughout the whole book. This a kind of faithfulness to the messiness and unpredictability of life as you live it, and unpredictability sometimes of the ways in which body and mind correspond or don't quite correspond to one another for a whole range of reasons. And Eli Clare says something kind of neat in the preface to the 2009 edition, the sort of re-release of Exile and Pride. In the decade since the initial release, I've often been asked, what do you want readers to take away from your book? The answer has become one of my activist mantras. I want non-disabled progressive activists to add disability to their political agenda. And at the same time, I want disability activists to abandon their single-issue politics and strategies. And my answer remains true in 2009 as it was in 1999, right? That political urgency is a really important part of the essays in this volume. Like there is, I don't want to say a kind of a mission, but there's a kind of an urgency to making the world better. That's part of what's going on here. But it's also at the same time almost two books in one, because it's also a very intimate personal memoir. In ways that are evocative, moving, disturbing, and I think at times nostalgic. And we want to think about if that's the right word to describe what's going on. There's a lot of language about home and return, whether return is possible, exile, and finding home in other kinds of places. So it's like I said, it almost feels like two books in one in some ways.
Yeah, there's a really interesting quote towards the end of that preface where he says, "When I'm asked, tell me, what is your book about? I always pause. The request seems straightforward, but how do I sum up a book that ranges from the clear cuts of Oregon to the history of the freak show, from the complexities of queer, rural, working class organizing to the disability politics of sexual objectification? Inevitably, I answer, home. I mean place, body, identity, community, family as home. I mean the hay pastures, trees, rocks, beaches, abandoned lots, kitchen tables, and sunflowers out back that have held and sustained us. I mean how we have fled from and yearned toward home. In the end, I mean a deeply honest, multi-issue politics that will make home possible."
Yeah, it's not a home that's in the past, but in the future, right?
Yeah. And it's very interesting to think of this kind of memoir / call to action as being about we must create home. In some ways, that runs counter to what we might expect from a narrative, a memoir, an activist memoir of a young person, a trans person, a queer person who grew up in a small town. That very often you get the sense of, well, we're running away from that and into the future.
Right.
And we're going to create new worlds of possibilities that are unfamiliar to us. And that's not quite what's going on here, right? This isn't looking out on the horizon for some unimagined space that offers new excitement, new possibilities, new potentialities. I mean, it does, but they're very grounded in this notion of home.
Yeah, there's this recognition that it's not just simply a one-way flow. You can't leave entirely behind you the place you came from or those who remain there and choose to remain there. One of the passages in the book I found really moving was this kind of account of going back, to the Pacific Northwest and encountering and thinking about queer people who were living there, who had formed networks of affiliation of different sorts, in a way that's different from what's possible in the cities. And this attentiveness, this activist attentiveness to, supporting these people, that how can I put it? It wasn't enough to sort of leave behind the past and look for a future. You had to bring the past with you into the future. One of the things that struck me in that passage you quoted is the listiness of it. Home, I answer home. I mean place, body, identity, community, family as home. I mean hay pastures, trees, rocks, beaches, abandoned lots, kitchen tables. What is that about, this listiness? Because there's a whole bunch of places in the book where this happens.
There is so much listing in this book.
I love it.
It's generally quite lovely, yeah. What is it about? I mean, it's definitely a moment of stopping and observing and noting each of the individual things that make up a scene, a community. Home is place, body, identity, community, family. The hay pastures, the trees, the rocks, the beaches, they accumulate into the home, into the specific home that he's thinking of.
Yeah, it's this cumulative quality, I think, which is really so evocative. And you see, like I say, you see it in a whole bunch of different kinds of settings. Early on in the book, there's this beautiful account of the landscape of the Pacific Northwest. And he says, I reveled in plant names: huckleberry, salmonberry, blackberry, salal, greasewood, manzanita, scotch broom, foxglove, lupine, rhododendron, vine maple, alder, tan oak, red cedar, white cedar, Port Orford cedar. I wanted a name for everything. I know it is not everybody's cup of tea, but I just love that kind of thing. I get an incredible pleasure out of listing. I think there are some people who do, right? Pleasure out of listiness. And it's cumulative, it's kind of vivid, and it gives you the sense of capaciousness, right? There's many, and yet they're all kind of one, right? Like there's a unity and multiplicity at the same time.
Or even when they aren't all one, there's this gathering of diversity. Feels like not quite the right word, but there's this gathering of difference, right? There's another passage later on where he says, we say, here we are in all our glory: male, female, intersex, trans, butch, Nelly, studly, femme, king, androgynous, queen. Like, it's this list again and again. It's this catalog of the diversity of all the options, of all the territories that have been found, and the implication that there may be many more yet to find.
That's right. That passage you're just quoting ends, "You don't have pronouns yet for us." You know, the
Yes.
idea that, like, even the multiplicity you have now, even that is going to be superseded, right? There's more.
Yeah, and it never will be fully catalogable.
That's right. That's right. It's so cool.
So something about the list encourages that thought, right? The list could go on
Mm-hmm.
seemingly forever.
Mm-hmm.
It comes to an end because, the sentence must come to an end, I suppose. But the types of plants in the world certainly doesn't come to an end there. And the types of gender in the world don't come to an end just because that sentence comes to an end.
Yeah, I think that's so neat. And it plays out in a couple of different ways. Like, one is that there's this kind of correspondence between the listiness you find in the natural world. And Claire gives us a number of examples of this, not just the plant names, but also stones. We also get enumerated in a way that is similarly very lovely. So there's the natural world has this kind of multiplicity. The human world in this sort of range of genders has this kind of multiplicity, but it also comes out kind of almost analytically in the text when Claire goes on to kind of unpack in the really amazing chapter that's called Freaks and Queers, which is, I found to be a really, meaty and interesting chapter in all kinds of ways, in terms of terminology around disability. So like this, the listiness is something that's really important in the memoir dimension. Like, if we think of this as two books in one, the listiness is really important in the memoir and they're all the natural landscape of place, and also in the kind of analytical activist dimension of it. Like, listiness has its place there as well.
Yeah, that chapter is really interesting because it's about all these different terms, some of which have been reclaimed and some of which haven't, and some of which have been reclaimed by some people, so to speak, but not necessarily universally. In fact, none of them are universally reclaimed.
Mm-hmm.
And in that chapter, he goes over this list of different words, queer, freak, etc., and then dives into each of them to look at them in their specificity and why he may or may not feel comfortable with them without trying to judge, not saying nobody should feel comfortable with these words, but like, this is my relationship with them. And this is the historical context that these words are coming from and how they're being used. And this is the sort of diving into and detailing and thinking about each of them individually that we need to do in order to make sense of the world and understand things in their rich contexts. So it's not just enough to say reclaiming a word is good. You have to actually look at the word and like what that reclamation is doing and where that comes from and what that might be. And so the list encourages you to take a moment at each one and think about them individually, right? Each of the different plants has a different behavior. If you care about plants, which I don't, but many people do, and I'm glad they do. If you care about a list like huckleberry, salmonberry, blackberry, sorrel, greasewood, etc., you will also probably care about each of the individual properties of those different plants, how you can tell them apart in the wild, and what you need to do to tend to them, or when to harvest or eat them, if that's the sort of thing that you would do with those, or, what they could be used for, how they relate to other parts of their environment. That is one of the features of a list. It's giving you individual things to think about, as well as thinking about the collective.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. And that invitation to think about those terms and to like linger over each of them as long as you need to do, again, struck me as very much part of the kind of that ethical dimensions of the essays written here. So right around that passage you were mentioning where we get the list of all these different terms around disability, you can see Eli Clare kind of thinking about it and like another kind of essay writer would just say, okay, here's my argument, here's this set of concepts, here's this set of concepts, here's somewhere we can go with it. But there's this, I don't know what to call it, slow progress at certain times, right? Where it's difficult and you have to pause and go back a little bit and then go forward a little bit. And he kind of holds you by the hand to do this. So in that passage, for example, there's that list that you mentioned: handicapped, disabled, cripple, gimp, retard, differently abled, freak. I need to stop here. Freak, I don't understand. It unsettles me. I don't quite like it. Can't imagine using it as some politicized disabled people do. Yet I want freak to be as easy as the words queer and cripple. And then there goes on for a while. And then the end of that passage, the end of this section of the essay, what is it about that word? What bitterness, what pain does it hold that cripple with its connotations of pitiful broken bodies and queer with its sweeping definitions of normality and abnormality do not? I want to unravel freak, to pull on the thread called history. And that's when we get this neat, I don't want to call it a digression. It's like a dilation. This is a word that sometimes gets associated with Thomas Brown and his Religio Medici, this idea that you just sort of go off on this other thing. And it seems like a digression, but it actually turns out to be the very heart of the matter. Right. And then you get this long sort of history of freak shows. And you're like, what? It's really interesting. And then when you get to the end, you understand there's like a kind of a microcosm for all of these forms that he's been talking about. It was a really interesting chapter, I thought.
I agree. It seems like, just from poking about and seeing what people's reactions to the book are, that the Freaks chapter is, for many people, the least popular chapter. I'm not sure why.
I think it's hard. I think it's a difficult chapter. I thought it was really powerful, though.
And I think it's also because of what you just described, that it seems like a bit of a tangent. I don't think anybody is picking this book up for a history of the freak show. And yet seeing how the freak show operated, how people who were labeled freaks maneuvered in this world where it maybe gave them some opportunities that they wouldn't have had otherwise, but it also, was reifying certain images to the public and making other people a lot of money, et cetera, all the different aspects of it that Claire talks about. You get all that, and then eventually you might realize, oh, this relates to what's going to come up even more in the next chapter, when we're going to be talking about sexuality and the disabled body, and the way that sexual objectification works with disabled people, how you might be treated as an object, as something to look at, as a freak, as something to gawk at.
Yeah. I think you're absolutely right. Like this idea of like the gaze, like of the way in which one becomes a spectacle, right? And what that dynamic is. That is a really important kind of linkage between what's happening here in the Freaks and Queers chapter and then what goes on to happen in the following chapters that bring out this whole question of what's role sexuality and display might play, right? But another thing I think that's happening in this chapter with regard to the account of freaks is this sense that they're, again, multiple and highly variable, right? He brings out the kind of the diverse range of people who are brought in and under the umbrella, under the label of freaks, right? And he gives you an account in certain places of almost, again, a kind of a list of the different kinds of people. He'll say, for example, the armless wonder played a fiddle on stage. The giant lived as royalty. The savage roared and screamed. These performances didn't create freaks as pitiful or tragic, but as curious, odd, surprising, horrifying, wondrous. Freaks were not super crips. They did not overcome disability. They flaunted it. There's a lot going on there, right? One is that, there's this one term, freaks, that's used in the sort of dynamic of the freak show to bring together a whole range of very, very different kinds of people, right? And so there's that multiplicity that's being sort of captured under a single kind of term and obscured under a single kind of term. And so I think he's making a larger point, right, about how that works, how, I don't want to call it othering, but like how that kind of imposition of a single label functions to flatten out the incredible heterogeneity that lies in humanity, right? But then beyond that, there's a way in which the people who are gathered under this label of freak almost kind of answer back or push back, right? They're not pitiful or tragic, but curious, odd, surprising, horrifying, wondrous. Again, that list of terms, right? They don't overcome disability. They flaunt it, right? There's a kind of power that comes with that. And so I feel like Eli Clare never kind of like, how can I put it? It's never a totally satisfying confusion. What he's done is kind of unpacked this extraordinarily, I don't know if it's ambiguous, like powerful and yet disturbing kind of dynamic that is somehow at play in what he's trying to capture here. I mean, I found that chapter like not totally successful, but super interesting.
So I'm curious, you mentioned that list of the different people, the different freaks, quote unquote, the different performers who would be at these shows. And there is a list, but he keeps coming back to them, right? They reappear as characters and they each get scenes and backstories, and they're all based on actual people. And then there are these little moments where, in a somewhat unexpected move for this kind of piece, I suppose, Claire writes italicized paragraphs, little notes to them, so to speak. William, late after the exhibits had closed, the Rube's gone home. Did you and your friends gather backstage to party, passing a bottle of whiskey round and round? Did you entertain some more, pull out your fiddle and play silly, squeaky songs? Or did you sit back and listen to one joke after another until you were breathless with laughter?
Yeah.
And then going back to, in many ways, working as a freak was similar to working as a prostitute, blah, 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 like a more theoretical approach to it. Yeah. What did those interjections, what are those attempts to directly speak to the individuals do for you?
Well, again, those were like moments that were like so powerful, right? They were like trying to draw a thread between the present and that past moment, and presumably draw a thread that in some ways relates to identity or to the way one is seen, and it's again, it's highly ambivalent, right? Because it's something that Eli Clare is not totally comfortable with, right? Doesn't like that term, isn't okay with that term quite, but at the same time, it's necessary to engage with it and to think about it and to sort of bring out that history. And I think the clearest crystallization, I think, of what's at stake in that thread, right, that links present and past, comes pretty much near the end of the chapter, when he sort of comes back from that dilation about the history, right, of the freak show, right, and says this. He talks about pride versus witness. He says, both witness and pride strengthen identity, foster resistance, cultivate subversion. People who have lived in shame and isolation need all the pride we can muster, not to mire ourselves in a narrowly defined identity politics, but to sustain broad-based rebellion. And likewise, we need a witness to all our histories, both collective and personal. Yet we also need to remember that witness and pride are not the same. Witness pairs grief and rage with remembrance. Pride pairs joy with a determination to be visible. Witness demands primary adherence to and respect for history. Pride uses history as one of its many tools. Sometimes witness and pride work in concert, other times not. And it struck me that the freak show thing is exactly that, right? It's that it's part of witnessing, right? You witness it. It's historical. The thread is there, right? But you can sometimes use witness as part of pride and sometimes not, right? Sometimes they work in concert, other times not. And that, that tension, I was calling it ambiguity before, and that's not really the right word for it. Ambiguity, ambivalence is not quite the right words for it. It's like yes and no, right? Witness, yes. Pride, I don't know. Right? I found that really interesting. Hard, but interesting. Was that the chapter that struck you as kind of the most provocative, or were there other parts of this book that you found really provocative?
Oh, that's a good question. I found that really interesting. And yeah, I suppose provocative as well. I also found the discussion of sexuality really interesting in the following chapter, which is called Reading Against the Grain, I Now Notice. And I'm wondering why it's called that. I'm not actually sure. It's an interesting title.
I wondered about that too. I found a quotation in the chapter that brings it out. It's someone else's words. Let me see if I can find it really quickly.
Oh, maybe that's what it is.
It's actually kind of neat, this quotation from Susan Stewart. Some of us have been, it's all part of what some theorists call reading across the grain. Some of us reading across the grain for so long that our eyes have splinters.
Oh, yes. Right. And in which case, reading against the grain here is talking about, we've got, Susan Stewart, that's the person that quote is from, and Susan Stewart of the lesbian sex art collective Kiss and Tell, framing the ambivalence about the lack of lesbian images made by lesbians and the way that you might encounter lesbian images if you are a lesbian and are hoping to see lesbian images and see yourself represented, but you're always seeing ones that are produced by and for men, basically. And yet you can still sort of look at them and read them across the grain and, get off on them if it works and if you've trained yourself to do that and you learn how to do that sort of thing.
And if that's what there is, right?
Yeah. And reading this in terms of a Playboy spread in, I believe, the 80s with Ellen Stoll as the model, who was a disabled person and the first disabled person to be a Playboy centerfold. And the reactions to that amongst different groups of people, amongst feminists, amongst disabled people, broadly speaking, with disabled people usually going, hooray, that's us, and feminists going, but it's Playboy, and that's bad, and you're bad if you're cheering this on. And it's like, well, it's clearly more complicated than that, and the desire to think through all the implications of that and hope that all of the parties involved would think about this in a more nuanced and complex way.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right.
But that very specific bind of, all right, as a disabled person, Claire argues, you are very often not seen sexually, especially if you are gendered female. If you're seen as a female body, there's an expectation if you're a young woman, if you're a young girl, that your body will be seen sexually and that you'll be expected to do all sorts of things to make that body more sexually appropriate, available, being part of this game of sexuality that starts occurring for many people when they're in their teens. You gotta have a boyfriend and you gotta put on the makeup and you gotta dress nice and so forth. As a disabled person, you're not expected to be part of that. There's a scene in which he talks about having been like catcalled basically by some teen boys. And then they realized that they were catcalling somebody who was disabled and apologize and say, we're not really like that. We thought you were. And like, what? that was an amazing scene. And I don't know, I kind of wanted that to be unpacked a bit more.
Yeah. I felt that too, that was a scene that, as a reader, you wanted to hear more about. There are a number of moments like that. It's a book that issues a lot of invitations, right? And brings you into really interesting and unexpected spaces. And I don't know about you, I didn't always feel totally satisfied, right? But maybe that's a function of a book that is about trying to get somewhere different.
Yeah. I don't think it was wrong that I didn't. Like, I don't think it was a poor authorial choice, but I didn't I was left wanting more from that moment. And maybe that's why I'm still thinking about it. But the point is that, your sexual agency, in a sense, has been removed from you, which on the one hand is removing this great burden that can crush many young women. And on the other hand, means that you don't get to participate in basic forms of sexuality as much as, or as fully as you might like to. And how do you control that image? How do you control your objectification? Like, what does it mean to want to be an object sometimes and to have control over how others see you as an object sometimes? And how do you negotiate that and think through that? It's really tricky. And I feel like it pulls up ideas that I've had in ways that haven't been directly related to trans issues or disability issues, just issues that people have had with their sexuality. But it really makes an interesting argument around them, or not argument, just it explores a situation that he found himself in, and others have found themselves in a really compelling way that affords quite a lot of nuance to it.
Yeah. And I think your way of describing it as kind of exploring and considering, again, as opposed to making an argument or coming to a conclusion, it's exactly what goes on here. There's a really neat passage that talks about this, where Claire says, "I won't deny that Ellen is sexually objectified in the pages of Playboy. But within the context of disability, the meaning of this objectification shifts. Ellen becoming a sex object, being seen and acknowledged as sexy, splashed in color across the pages of a sex magazine, represents an important fault line, a sudden and welcome admission of disabled people, or at least one white heterosexual disabled woman whose disability can be made invisible before a camera, as sexual." Right? You can see that sort of thoughtfulness where it's like, at least, you know what I mean? It kind of like points out, and race and, heterosexual, like all these things get pointed out. And then there's this, like, right after that, there's this lovely kind of rumination. I look again at Ellen draped over her wheelchair, Ellen dressed to display her ample cleavage and long legs. The photo reminds me of the Ford and GM ads where scantily dressed white women drape themselves over cars and trucks. I remember learning how to pick apart advertisements, to recognize what the capitalist, sexist, racist moneymongers really mean to sell. I feel compelled to ask a rhetorical question. Can't you recognize the difference? Right? The answer is entirely about context. So like, even while, Eli Clare is going to come out and say, in the context of what disabled people are saying, that was a choice that, it was appropriate for Ellen to make, right? To be in Playboy in that way. But even so, there's this kind of like noticing the other side, noticing the limitations, noticing the complexities, and reminding you that you need to think about context. Like your judgment is always going to be very contingent. So I guess what I mean by the ethics of this book. I mean, it's never spelled out in so many words as a kind of an ethics, but that's what I think is being modeled, right?
There's a really great phrase in the final long essay of the book called "Stones in My Pocket, Stones in My Heart," which I think a lot of readers found this to be their favorite essay. And it certainly got some really great stuff in it. But there's one moment when a paragraph begins, "But before I make it too simple." And I thought that is like the motto of the book.
Yeah.
This is a book about not making it simple, about trying to add complexity.
Yeah, never.
Where it's needed. and that if something is simple, it might be useful for a moment, but you have to move past that and make it more complex. And I think that's in many ways the best lesson of the book. Mm-hmm. I don't know. It's a book that I felt a bit odd about reading. I mean, it's, a lot of the notes about disability and sexuality and trans issues were ones that seemed familiar to me. The ideas weren't sort of making my head explode. I could see how they absolutely would to somebody who's never thought about disability issues before, or trans issues, or gay issues, but
Mhm.
nevertheless, this commitment to not making it too simple, and the illustration of all the ways that he prevented himself from getting too simple and corrected himself when he caught himself being too simple, is really marvelous.
Yeah, and again, like we were talking about before, this kind of layered quality to the time that's being represented here. Like, there's the book on the one hand is reflecting a certain perspective that, comes from the book's initial publication in 1999, and also a level of thinking that is reflected in the annotations that are added and the prefatory material that's added in 2009, right? And so there's like this sense of like we were talking about before in connection with, the role of history and the role of witnessing from the past, right? You never let go of the past. Like, you never throw that away in order to move into the future. You take it with you. It's always in some way also with you.
There's also the moment that you're reading the book and who you are when you read the book, I suppose. But that is an interesting thing as well. And one of the responses to the book that I encountered when I was seeing how people respond to this book was somebody who basically was reading it in, I think it was December 2016, and was like, this book, especially the first several chapters of the book, is all about defending the way of life of rural, white, racists, blue collars, a whole set of people in the Pacific Northwest.
Yeah.
And being like, they're racist, but we need to keep thinking more about them. And I'm just not in a position to do that right now.
I can, yeah, that was something that I found also a little disorienting, I have to say.
Yeah, that's what I'm curious about. How did you take that? Like, where were you coming from with especially those kinds of issues?
Well, yeah, so I was bumping up against that too because of the kinds of things that have been happening over the past several years, right? I mean, like, there was an awareness around, like, the Black Lives Matter movement and the kinds of events that have been taking place and, like, all of it, right? But then I immediately thought, well, the book, this edition of it came out in 2009. It's a different place, right? I was trying to be kind of generous around that. But then there were a couple of other moments. Like, there's this one moment where, in the context of talking about terms that have had to be reclaimed, right? Claire uses the N-word a few times.
Mm-hmm.
And I was really jarred by that, right? And I don't know that I would criticize it. Like, I don't know, right? But I would not be appropriate right now, right? And I don't know, like, I stumbled over that.
I listened to this as an audiobook as well as reading the page, because I like to do that sometimes. And yeah, getting to the point where the white narrator had to read that page and the N-word and so forth. Like, ooh,
yeah,
this is especially awkward.
Yeah. And so I don't know, it may be that was a very purposeful choice to use that. And I don't know, I don't know.
Yeah.
But more broadly though, this question about the rural white working class culture, right? That there, like, I keep thinking about nostalgia, and the word nostalgia never gets used in this book to talk about what's going on there. But there's this loving way of talking about, the place that he came from, right? And I don't know, I found this nostalgia for small town white America to be really disturbing, because I also grew up in small town white America. I mean, not in the Northwest, but in, like, Northwest New Jersey, and I was like, could not get out of there fast enough. You know what I mean? I was like, and so, like, and I've always been puzzled by this, because I have, like, in my family, right, there's, like, some people who also, like, left, but by and large, people really wanted to, even if they went away to college, right, they really wanted to go home again.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, okay, but I can't wrap my head around it. So both in terms of, like, we talked about this book as almost being like two books, like one, a memoir, and on the other side being a kind of political call to action. On the political call to action side, I'm like not totally comfortable with the level of sympathy around, these people, right? But then also on the personal level, I'm like, oh God, I have a really hard time feeling empathy for that. Right? And also, like, there's this weird discourse around class, because not just about race, it's also about class issues, right? It's never uncomplicated. And these are very intimately intertwined in Claire's account.
Yeah, the town that he grew up in is described as being very rural, white working class culture. And it is mostly people who are loggers. And there's a long description of the sort of job opportunities that would await him if he moved back. Like, not just the sort of interpersonal dynamics, what would it be like to be a trans or genderqueer or whatever, person living in this small town, but also like what even could you do to make money, especially as a disabled person or especially as somebody with the particular disabilities that he's got. So there's this long economic description explaining like sort of what has happened here. And then it's also about the main economy of that area, the logging, collapsing, both because of overlogging and poor management of the forest areas, but also because of environmental activism and you know, the spotted owl controversy that we all remember from the 90s and things like that. And like there's a negotiation going on. And so it is a bit tricky. And like Eli's family was relatively well-to-do class-wise going into this, but not relatively well-to-do compared with the other people he would meet later, like in college or, you know, in a sort of professional literary academic circuit, probably.
Yeah, I found that whole description really weird. Like, there's this emphasis on the rural white working class culture, and the parents. He says neither of them has ever become comfortably middle class, but his mom is a PhD and his dad's a high school teacher. I'm like, well, I don't know, man. Like, it's like they're a lot more with it than you know. I don't know.
Yeah, and he recognizes that their family never had to worry about food.
Yeah,
but also they weren't like rolling in luxuries by any stretch.
Yeah,
and having a PhD and not using it is different, but it does indicate where you come from, right? It indicates a set of sensibilities, and it means at the very least that there's going to be probably a lot of books around the house, which sounds like it was the case.
Yeah, he says books, ideas, and education were their most highly valued possessions.
Exactly.
Right? So
exactly.
yeah, absolutely. So that was like, it was weird, right? I mean, I think a lot of the like anxiety and ambivalence I brought to all that, like part of it came out of like the political dimension, but part of it is just like me just reading that going like, wow, it did not feel like that.
Like, it's so astonishing because like he's not shy about saying all of these problems about it.
Oh yeah.
And how poorly he would fit in and how he couldn't make the kind of life he would want to have in that world. Mm-hmm. Like he is in exile. He describes himself as in exile because the things about home that he would like to still participate in, the landscape and a certain type of small town culture, you know, where everybody knows each other, which sounds miserable to me, but fine, he can have it.
Well, yeah, like that's what I mean by this like language of nostalgia. There's like this, only later did I understand what I lost by leaving, right? And then there's this description of, I just want to find it. The social ethic that has friends dropping by out of the blue for a smoke and cup of coffee, to catch up on the gossip or help finish shingling the roof, to a plain-spoken, understated way of being. This allegiance underscores all that I lost when I left rural Oregon. And I'm like, okay, like, oh God. I was like, oh man, I just have a hard time with that.
It's not for me, but you know, but I do understand why he likes it, right? I understand what he's feeling the nostalgia, if we want to call it that, for.
But yeah, it's interesting he doesn't use word like home and exile show up all the time, but not the word nostalgia, which I found it's clearly purposeful choice.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, I mean, nostalgia, you know, etymologically meaning the pain for home, but it kind of has taken on other meanings as it's been used in English. So I could see why you wouldn't necessarily want the trappings of that. And it's certainly not a rosy portrait of small town Oregon life that he's yearning for. In fact, it's a radically different form of what home was like.
It's idealized though, like seriously, the neighborliness that had my mother trading sugar for eggs, baked goods for hand-me-down clothes, and an endless cycle of borrowing and lending, to the social ethic that has friends dropping by out of the blue. I'm like, this is a pretty picture. I mean, I grew up like this. I mean, I don't know. Like, I'm like, it was really gross. It was like, I don't know.
Yeah.
It's me. I don't know. I just read it and I'm like, oh God, no.
You got out and you're happy for getting out.
Thank God. I mean, I don't know. I feel bad about it, but like, I mean, I just could not.
Sure. But if we accept that there are some people who like those kinds of things, it would be nice if there was a place for them to be able to go and feel at home.
Yeah, and to be really clear, like, it's not like, I honestly don't think it's like an elitist sensibility. It was like racist and sexist and repressive. And it was like terrible in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
You know, like that's true.
He agrees.
Yeah, God, I guess.
He
I mean, that's a generous person. I'm just not.
Well, you know, that's why we need lots and lots of utopias.
That's true. You're right.
I don't want to be there either, though. You know, but I definitely am cool with other people wanting to be. I'm not cool with the racism. I'm
No.
going to make that clear. But I'm cool with people wanting a small town life in a beautiful part of the world. And that part of the world is pretty beautiful.
And, again, this is one of the ways in which that, like I said, that ethical dimension of the 2009 annotations kind of comes out. There's this one moment, I don't know if you remember, fairly early on in the book, where Eli Clare is talking about Aunt Margaret, his Aunt Margaret, and Aunt Margaret has a partner named Barb. So he says, if you don't believe me, let me take you to my maternal grandfather's funeral. At the service, I sat with family, my sister to the right, my great Aunt Esther to the left, my Aunt Margaret in front of us, her lover of many years to her right. Barb is an African-American lesbian, an unmistakable butch whether or not she's in heels and a skirt. I'm quite sure my aunt has never introduced Barb to Uncle John or Aunt Esther, Uncle Henry or Aunt Lillian as her partner, lover, or girlfriend. Yet Barb is unquestionably family. Hey, and it's a little pretty, But then, on the following page, there's a note. It says this, reading this story now in 2009, I'm struck by the ways I've downplayed racism and my own white privilege. Even though Barb and Margaret did experience tacit acceptance, which probably muffled direct expressions of overt racism, I know that in my extended white rural family, Barb navigated a strong undercurrent of covert racism, including suspicion, curiosity, stereotyping, and disrespectful humor. It's all too easy for me to manifest white privilege by disregarding this undercurrent. And I really admire that, right? Like not changing it, not revising the 1999 text to hide that, but to say, you know what, I was wrong. And now I see this. Like, I like that.
It'll be interesting to think more about this notion of home and what home is and what it means to feel like you belong to a home and why some people maybe don't feel that way. I don't have any of that sense of, that's home. This place where I grew up is the land that I should belong to. I've lived in different parts of 2 countries and I've visited other places where I've thought, sure, I could move here if I had to. And none of them have felt like that. I've never felt sort of claimed by the land or that connected to a specific land in a way that I see Eli Clare and other people writing about. And it sounds like maybe you don't either, even if you may be fond of the tri-state area.
Actually, the place I feel deeply at home, funnily enough, is a place that you've been at with me, out on the farther part of Cape Cod, out in North Truro, where we've always stayed since I was like a young teenager.
Yes,
We'd go visit family out there.
Of course.
And I truly do think of that as home, even though I don't have a home there, but I just go back there every year, right? When I can. And I feel like that feels like home.
That's right.
Which is weird, right? Because I didn't come from there.
No, that's actually very interesting. Well, the next cluster of texts that we're going to be looking at will be focused on land, and some of that will be these issues of home and being away from home, maybe being in exile, but certainly being far from home sometimes, and how you relate to the land that you live on. And I think we'll be retouching some of these issues that I kind of didn't expect us to start talking about when we picked this book out.
Yeah, there's a beautiful moment early in this book where Eli Clare talks about landscape. And I don't know if this passage struck you as much as it did me. There's this beautiful description of the Pacific Northwest landscape and then description of now, right? I live in a very different landscape now. The land is flat and open. The trees lose their leaves in an explosion of red, yellow, and orange every fall, regrow them in a burst of green every spring. The green here isn't layered and shaded in 1,000 varieties. Often I hunger for the ocean. And he goes on to say he collects all these things, shells, maps, stones, fir cones, wood, to remind me of the landscape I still call home. So there's 2 landscapes always in play, right? The landscape I still call home and the landscape I live in. And they're like I don't want to say in dialogue, that's not the right word, but they're not entirely separate in some way.
It feels like they're always being held up against each other. They're references for each other.
That's right. They're always both there, right? And that's just one example of like how land functions. And I think we're going to be able to unpack that in really interesting ways in the stuff we go on to read.
So what are we reading next?
I believe we're starting with Laxdela Saga.
Yes.
Now, you've read that before, right?
I have read this before, and it was a long time ago, but I remember really loving it. And I hope it will turn out to be as appropriate for this topic as I seem to recall it is.
I think it'll be fun. I've never read it, but I've wanted to for a long time, so that's great.
Have you read any sagas?
Yeah, of bits and pieces, but I haven't really worked on them. So I don't have, I don't know a huge amount about them, but I'm looking forward to spending some time with them.
The Icelandic sagas are a really interesting genre of literature and really stand out in many ways from a lot of the other medieval literature that I've encountered, and from contemporary literature to contemporary to us literature. So I'm super excited about doing that one and returning to the sagas and yeah, it'll be lots of fun. And then we will be following that up with another more contemporary to us book.
Yeah, Robin Wall Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass, which is a book I read this past year. And I think a lot of people have been reading it, and I feel really good about that, but I also feel there's like complexities raised by that. So I'm really excited about reading that together.
Yeah, you've been all over this book.
Oh God, I love that book. It meant a lot to me in a difficult time and opened up a lot of doors. And I've been reading some of her other work as well. So maybe we'll touch on some of that as well.
All right. Well, that'll be interesting. And we'll be finally ending with an undisputed classic.
What is it?
We will be starting the first of the 3 books that make up the one book that is The Lord of the Rings. We'll be doing The Fellowship of the Ring by J.R.R. Tolkien.
And we're going to have a lot of feelings about the Shire.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be a highly Shire and not Shire focused episode. What's it like to be in the Shire? What's it like to leave the Shire? Why is it so scary? Can we go back to the Shire? Is it lunchtime?
We should probably eat 11s while we're recording that episode.
Exactly. Oh, it'll be so good. And as I said, this was a really interesting book that I did not expect to start us down this path, but I think it's done an interesting job and might be putting some thoughts and issues into play that we wouldn't have had otherwise.
No, definitely.
Which was why we read it.
The unexpected themes, right? This happens to us all the time.
Yeah. All right. Well, in the meantime, if you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at spouter@megaphonic.fm, or we're on Twitter @thespouter. We'd love to hear from you. And show notes with links for anything we've mentioned in this episode, and maybe some other helpful links, will be at megaphonic.fm/spouter/41. And the Spouter-Inn is one of the fancy little podcasts over at Megaphonic FM. So, until next time.
See you again at the Spouter-Inn.